Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. We have quite a bit of things to go over today, and although it's quite a bit, still not as much as usual, so we may have a bit of a shorter show, which is usually what I say when we have a 2 hour show. So we can look forward to that. But just a little brief on some of the things we're going to be discussing today is there's some big news out of Ukraine, particularly Severodonetsk, which we've been covering for past several weeks, and again, that will be all on you because I know you're like a dog with a bone like that. I cannot get you to let go of any of that, and it's that. Don't get me wrong, I love it. The audience loves it. We also have some news about Saudi Arabia and energy prices, Syria, and a little bit of news of the UK, and of course the roundup with the European Union and NATO as usual. But without further ado, I will give the reins over to you, and please do let us know each and every meticulous detail of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine right now.
Okay. Well, I'm going. I'll start off the show. How about this? It's a front line of several hundred kilometers. So I'm gonna, and it's in a crescent shape. So I'm going to start from the south, work to the east, and to the northeast. Uh, so uh, Beginning in the south, in the Kherson region, um, there have been some strikes around Kherson where munitions were knocked down, as well as I believe an AN-26. This is a transport plane. Uh, there's no footage. The Russians claim that they did this. This is in their official report. I've taken a look at these. It's the Soviet era transport plane. I think it can carry probably one tank and one armored personnel carrier. uh, if I'm being generous, my guess is it contained munitions. Uh, m- Mostly artillery, originating probably out of Bulgaria because Bulgaria is providing the munitions for the M777s that the Americans gave to the Ukrainians. And it still stands, right? Ukraine is getting these munitions and artillery. It lost them basically in the first 6 weeks of the war, um, 5 6 weeks, and that's around the time that it lost also almost all of its aircraft. All the aircraft coming in is what its parts are coming in 27s that are then assembled. Anyhow, so suffered a hit, and there was a plane that was knocked down uh, in the general front line, right? Um, Most of the strikes that have been happening are happening around what the Ukrainians call Mykolaiv, that the Russians call Nikolaev. It's the same town, but there has been fighting for another town due east of there, uh, called Davidov Brod. Um, this town has gone back and forth, and apparently it's back in Russian hands now. But it's just something I've been watching on the southern front. And there was also, that attempt by the Ukrainians to mount an offensive against the Russians on the southern front. That did not end well. We don't know what the numbers are, but even the Ukrainians claimed that there were high casualties and a lot of military equipment was lost in the process. Again, the numbers I don't know. The videos I've seen, I would say at least a dozen military vehicles, at least that. Um, but there's no one is confirming one way or another. Then if we move uh, eastward along the south front, we come up to where most of the fighting is taking place, and this is in the Donbass. Um, there have been several new salients that have opened up. These are small, but they're creating an encirclement of both the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk region, and then southwest of there is where we have the Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So I would say the most significant thing that has happened is there is a small town with a Russian lavra there. It is a monastery, a skete, and it's been there for a very long time. Last week it was bombed. Both sides claimed the other side did it. Uh, However, in the process, two monastics and two lay people who were visiting were killed. They were just buried yesterday and today. I mean, a few days ago. But yesterday, this town was liberated, and what's important is its liberation has meant now that the Russians have a way to reach Slavyansk. By capturing this town, it has placed them within 20 kilometers of central Slavyansk. Um, Now they are on the other side of the river, meaning they've crossed it over. The Ukrainians have blown up a bridge there, and there was several platoons. The Russians claim about 80 men were trapped um, on the wrong side of the river, essentially. And the Russian commander said we let them swim across, and they wouldn't fire on them as they swam across. So, anyways, there are other towns in this region right now. Some of it is quite hilly. The laver itself, this monastery, is located on a hill, by the way. And it's actually very pretty if you find it. So that is approaching Slavyansk almost directly northwest, 20 kilometers away. From the southeast side, there is another salient that is forming, and please forgive me. The town that I'm talking about is called Svyatogorsk. Um, Gorsk means like high up. And the other town from which a new salient is forming, ironically, also has a church involved. This time, a wooden church, also a Lavre Skete monastic uh, uh, complex. Now the church is historical, or rather, it's a recreation of a historical church. That's what was burnt down, and this one it's fairly certain that the Ukrainians burnt it down as they were retreating. This area that I'm talking about, which is on the opposite side of Slavyansk, uh, is it's around the Popasnaya area. It's not far from Donetsk city at all, and so it was a recreation of a wooden church that was actually destroyed during World War II. So I imagine they will rebuild it again, but it was, it was quite sad to see it burn down.
Well, I'm glad you bring these up
But
because I think it touches on a broader trend, which we certainly haven't ignored, but I think a lot of people have ignored since the start of this conflict, going all the way back to 2014. A large crux of what's happening in Ukraine now, it's certainly not the primary cause, and in fact, you could argue it is a result of the conflict in Ukraine and the way that they're trying
yeah,
to maneuver things is that, of course, the State Department has been trying to foment schism within the church, and that it's
yeah,
become
yeah,
a popular sticking point of Ukrainian nationalists to want to foment schism in the church because they don't want to be under the jurisdiction of course, the Russian church, which leads into that, which has led to actually a lot of the violence that's been happening, particularly against churches, monasteries, etc. And it's been two pronged. A lot in Western Ukraine, you see that uh, the Uniate Catholic churches, the Eastern Catholics who are in communion with Rome, have in some of the jurisdictions in the East and some of the localities in the East have cracked down hard on the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine presence there, and then of course there's the startup Ukrainian Orthodox Church, I suppose we can call it, that has also been trying
Yeah.
to seize property or again, just we've gone over this in great detail, and there are several accounts that people have put together just showing instance after instance, particularly since the start of the war, of what's happening to Orthodox churches that are still under the Russian Church, and it has not
Right.
been a pleasant thing to watch by far. And this is just more continuing of that trend that you were getting at right here.
Right. And it's also part of the policy of destroying anything Russian. It's like taking down a statue of Pushkin. It was his birthday a few days ago, and renaming this street to Stephen King Street, the great novelist Stephen King.
The greatest in American literature by
Oh my
far.
God, it's so paltry. Some stupid anti-Trumper like celebrity who's written dozens of trash horror books.
And once again,
Comes-
it's getting into that idea that they're trying to even defang Ukrainian nationalists to the point where it's like the claims of the Ukrainian nationalists, as we covered, and even still to this day, is that the Muscovites are the pretenders and we're the real roots. They're even trying to change that, which makes it all the more convoluted. That again,
yes.
I can't imagine that like Ukrainian nationalists, despite all their faults, are probably too happy about any of this because I think it's is Pushkin one of the ones I know it's all of them, but is Pushkin one of the big ones that they claim is actually Ukrainian? Because I know they do for
Not that I know of.
I know they do for
Not
like
that I know of.
pretty much every one else, but I couldn't remember any particular claims about Pushkin. But getting at the point is uh, the entire thing about Ukrainian national identity is just saying whatever is Russian is theirs. But of course, you take the next logical step, everything that's Russian has to go, which creates quite the contradiction. Not that I think the people who actually want this war to happen do care, but it's worth pointing out.
Right, and you can see this internationally. This has happened as well. The three Russian violinists that were in Italy, that were part of a competition of classical music, were barred from competing. All kinds of ridiculous nonsense like that. So they're totally encouraged by the West. Um, this is part of that whole moralism of cancel culture that you see, where they try to eradicate the memory of their evil opponent at all costs. But the other thing I should say about the churches is, so since like 2018, 2019, there has been a schismatic church that has been formed that is not in communion with Moscow, that is ostensibly an Orthodox church, separate from both the Orthodox Ukrainian church that is in communion with Moscow and from the Uniate, uh, what some people call the Greek Catholic Church of Western Ukraine, that is in communion with Rome. But what also has happened is the church that is in communion with Moscow, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, um, it had gone through a vote, uh, basically of asking for autocephaly. And I think this is the case because the pressure from Ukrainian nationalists interrupting some of these priests. Some of these priests are tortured in the past. It's suspected that some of them have been killed. And it isn't because the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is in communion with Moscow, it's not because they are in favor of the war. They have indeed condemned the war, and they have prayed for its speedy end, and they have disagreements with Kirill. They disagree with Moscow over this war, but none of this stuff is good enough, right? That simply will not do, and so they will still literally take over a church. A few episodes back, we discussed uh, how in three different towns, three different churches were attacked, and some of them, of course, um, lost their church. Like, period. Their church has been taken over. Um, so, um, as far as I understand, somebody in the audience can correct me. Uh, it has the church is still technically in communion with Moscow. I imagine what it's going to ask for is an autocephaly, which will make it independent, and maybe that will quell um, the nationalists, although I doubt it.
Yes, which is, I mean, that's
Uh,
at the heart of this entire schism when you get down to it because of the actions of the other churches, particularly the one out of Constantinople, the titled Ecumenical Patriarch, just basic,
yes.
just basic way the Orthodox Church is laid out. I'm sure most of you already know this, but just to give a brief description for anyone who might not. So just to contrast from the West, you have the Pope in Rome, who is the universal bishop of the church, whereas in the East, in the Orthodox Church, you have again the several different bishops and patriarchs. None of them really outrank each other. Now, of course, we do have a primate of the church, somebody who is a symbolic first, which is what Rome was for the first 1,000 years of the church. But I won't get too much into detail about this. Maybe at a different time. But there's people who are far more eloquent than me who can explain this to you. But just in brief, so you have that, and of course they all have jurisdictions over their own churches, which are all in communion with each other. However, um, Constantinople, which something to note is that the appointment of the patriarch does have to be a Turkish citizen approved by the Turkish government. So there is state influence in that much. And of course,
Hmm.
when you include the U.S. State Department putting pressure on Turkey, you could see how some interesting results can come out of that. But more or less, they recognize the church in Ukraine without Moscow's approval, which led to this entire crisis happening in the first place. Just a brief 1 minute history of
Yeah.
that.
Yes. So that is what has oh, that's what's been developing, and we're just saying that the church that was in communion with Moscow, as far as I understand, it still is. But the warning, according to Ortho Christian, which is a Telegram channel that keeps track of all of the latest news, uh, only a local council of the Russian Orthodox Church, including hierarchs, clerics, monastics, and laity, has the authority to change the status of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The Russian Synod reminds in its resolutions from today's meeting. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's active. We don't know really where this might go in 2, 3 months, 6 months, or a year. To be perfectly frank about it. So far at the moment, yes, they still are in communion, but there are efforts to change that, and I'm sure that's from pressures.
Well, another angle to
Will
also
it?
look at this from, not to dwell too much on the,
I mean, essentially, that means there are two Ukrainian churches right now,
uh,
and
yes.
again, it's that identity that they're fighting for. You know, an identity, a kind of remapping of Ukrainianism.
And not to dwell too much on church politics in this particular instance, but when you look at the circumstances that are happening right now, they're not unheard of. You've had these sort of things happen throughout, of course, the past 2,000 years, but and there's numerous examples. It's just that the current one we're going through is, I would say, it's somewhat unique given the nature of the American Empire's influence in it. But I will also say, however, getting into that again for the time being, yes, they are still in communion with Moscow. That is it, and there is, of course, the possibility that the schism does grow out of that. But again, it's just one of those things that's active, one of those things you have to keep your eye on. Uh, I don't think when it at
Hmm.
least comes to like the political side of the church, which again is uh, I mean, I do this show and I find that still hard to wrap my head around. So forgive me if I leave anything out or sound ignorant about
Yeah.
anything. It still hasn't been spared the rapid movement of the modern world, and it is just something to watch. And also, we are in a bit of a unique position because it has been pointed out by again a few I believe it was particularly a few priests who are pretty educated in the history of the church. If I can find the interviews I was watching, I'll put it where when it comes to nation state versus nation state, this is the first real war between two Orthodox nations as opposed to what you've had in Western Europe and otherwise, where you have had that religions, not caused by war, but fought by people and nations that largely adhere to the same religion. I mean, just look at the history of Western Europe. Now, there has been times where, of course, you know, Orthodox armies have been against each other, but in terms of like nation state versus nation state, this is sort of uncharted territory. Not entirely, but quite a bit of it is.
Yeah. So they had, the council that they had was on the 27th, and basically they made uh, uh, strong expression of their disagreement of or this fractile war with Kirill and how much they disagree with them. I'll just read to you what they said. The council's resolution. The council condemns the war as a violation of God's commandment and expresses its condolences to all those who have suffered. The council appeals to the authorities of Ukraine and the authorities of Russia to continue the negotiation process. We express our disagreement with Patriarch Kirill of Moscow and all Russia regarding the war in Ukraine. The Council adopted relevant amendments and additions to the status on the administration of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, indicating the full autonomy and independence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The Council approves the resolution of the councils of the bishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church decision and of the Holy Synods of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that met in the period since the last council, which was July 8th, 2011. The council approves the activities of the chancellery and synodal institutions of the Ukrainian Orthodox. The council considered the restoration of making chrism in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church during the period of martial law when relations between dioceses and central church leadership are uh, complicated or absent. The council considers it expedient to grant diocesan bishops the right to independently make decisions on certain issues of life and that fall within the competence of the Holy Synod or the primate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So you can see that, therefore, the Kiev Metropolitan of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church receives appeals from different countries with requests to open Ukrainian Orthodox parishes. In this regard, the Council expresses its deep conviction that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church cannot leave its faithful without spiritual care. So, I mean, they are going for an independence, which is not fully secured right now. But it doesn't. The resolutions don't specify how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church statutes were amended to reflect its full independence. But that is what I think is actually happening, and this is a. I mean, this is a blow. Um, this is not good for peace in the region, and for like a lasting peace and unity.
Yes, and just to compare
What?
to a similar situation, the situation with Macedonia was that schism was just healed a
Yeah.
matter of weeks ago, and it was a bit interesting
Right.
because the Serbians, I believe, also turned right around and then gave them full autocephaly. So that situation has been
Yeah.
completely laid to the rest. But I think the Balkans are probably the prime example of what these sort of things can do. Now, I'm not one to certainly blame wars and conflicts on religion, but we're lying to ourselves. We're saying it's not a motivating factor, and I'm not even saying that in a way to condemn it. Like if you believe in something, you're gonna fight tooth and nail for it, and frankly, I can't blame you. And I wish I had. I'd like to think I have that much conviction about my beliefs, but when it comes to these sort of things, and again, the Balkans have really been the testing ground for this. Just sowing these seeds of division and really trying to foment conflict and just disunity and keeping everything divided. Sort of,
Yeah.
I mean, sort of what they do in the Middle East. They play on religious conflicts in the Middle East all the time. But point being is, and they've been trying this for years. and are just now making headway. They're doing this with the situation in Ukraine as well, and I fear this will only go further. And honestly, I will tell anyone out there who uh, isn't Orthodox, don't think it can't happen to you, whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, whatever. I mean, they'll do the exact same thing to you. They will trample over your beliefs. They simply do not care. I mean, I think there's
Yeah.
one or two
I
groups
don't
they
think
won't
if there
touch,
was
but we won't get into
yeah.
that right now.
Yeah, had there been no war, I don't think this split would have happened. I can understand, the fake ecumenical Ukrainian Orthodox Church that got made whole cloth in Istanbul with the help of the CIA and the Greek patriarch there. But this is another matter. In fact, this is much worse in that sense. But we'll have to see where it goes. And given the direction that it's going, it might not go in a very good place. And as you mentioned, the Macedonian Orthodox Church received autocephaly, but this was after 55 years, and it was basically a church that was schismatic, like for a half a century, right? Um, so, anyways, we pray that that there won't be a split and that the war ends soon. I have to say, like if you're on Telegram and you're watching like all these drone videos, mostly of Ukrainian soldiers getting bombed, and like I'll be honest, it's and even the guys that get captured, it's kind of heartbreaking to be perfectly honest. Now I know some of them are scummed, and they were happy to shell Donetsk, and I'll get to that because, of course, as Ukrainian troops are withdrawing from some of these regions today, apparently, according to DPR's sources, about 700 fighters in Avdiivka have left this city. This town is like literally right next door to Donetsk. I don't think it's more than 10 kilometers. And what they're doing is they're launching from there into downtown Donetsk and the regions. Now, in the entire Donbass region, the last week, I would say the last 4 days, 10 people have been killed, dozens have been injured, and multiple strikes. So I understand, like, and also the idea of just blaming Azov for this is, isn't really enough. Like, the fact is, some of the Ukrainian Marines have been doing this for a very long time. There are other groups like Pravi Sector. Now, I don't know if they're goading them on to do this or else. We know that from some testimonies, Ukrainians that have deserted, so trying within a larger group, and not everybody in that group made it out alive. So that has happened.
Yes, and not to
Anyways,
speak too much in their defense. In
but I
fact,
don't
not
want to
to
take
speak in.
away how bad it's just I'm watching these guys surrender. Some of them, like, I mean, they look as old as me, and I mean, it's things aren't good. Things aren't good uh, right now in that area, particularly for the Ukrainian forces. You had Zelensky going on the 100th day of the war to, it might have been in Kramatorsk or Bakhmut, sorry, not far from Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, to claim that they, by pushing in uh, more of their troops, these actually weren't their troops. They were mostly Polish and Georgian volunteers who are fighting, and they claimed they took something like 20. Um, the truth is they only control a chemical plant called Azot, um, within the central part of the city of Severodonetsk that rubs against the river, separating it from um, Lysychansk. So um, fierce fighting there, fierce fighting north of Slavyansk, now only 20 kilometers away. and other salients, smaller salients, forming and pushing uh, elements of the Ukrainian army that have been shelling positions in Donbass and setting alight one of the churches. That like, but this is, every time they know they're going to lose, like their idea is to cause the maximum amount of damage before they have to leave. Particularly because for them, they know this region is a region that has never liked them. Recent notebooks in Mariupol were found where this notebook apparently belonged to one of the Azov members, leaders, who said 70% of this town is absolutely against us, are for the Russians. The remaining 30%, well, maybe, I don't know, a small number like is for them. Another number doesn't really care as long as life can be normal. Uh, so, but that's it basically for my updates. The only other thing is fighting around Kharkov is renewed. Um, it's not really very different than what I said last show. Um, there might be a town here or there that the Russians have gained, but not much. Most of the action, not that there is an action in Kharkov, but most of the action happening right now is happening in the Donbass. That's where most of the fighting is taking place, and the cauldron is closing in on them. And yeah, so that's really all I have for the technical, for the minutia of the war in Ukraine.
Yes, and I just did have a few things on that, and I just have something else I'll touch on before we move on from Ukraine, and something you were saying about, just the nature of the war in general. I've always maintained since the beginning of this, I'm not happy that this war is happening. I don't revel in this, but at the end of the day, I still do squarely blame NATO for all of this. That I will most likely not
Yeah,
waver on.
yeah, me too.
And then, to touch on the other point is, I think something that also has to be remembered. You know, the people fighting this war on both the Russian and Ukrainian sides, except some of these really schizo volunteers and more radical groups like Azov, those kind of people aside, I mean most of them are just everyday people who feel the obligation to fight for their nation, which I think is a healthy thing that probably everyone feels at some point in their lives, whether it's to a nation or some other greater group that they do have loyalty to. And as for some of the actions, I'm certainly not going to uh, justify them, but I mean, under these sort of circumstances, even those normal everyday people can be pushed to do very drastic things. I mean, you look at some of these things, like I think probably one of the most egregious examples is, one of the most present examples is the Vietnam War, where you have all these reports of all these just like massacres that outright happened, and it's not exactly like the people who did them were. I mean, of course, some of them had to be just statistically were just sadistic and reveled in violence and carnage. But like, after a certain point, like it's intense mental pressure, and people just break sometimes. And especially
Yes.
in something like a war zone. And again, that's not to justify anything, but think I think we have to, with this war and every other war, also take a step back and accept really egregious examples, realize that most of the people fighting this war are just everyday people. Now, again, I'll rip all day into Zelensky and his NATO handlers and all those people, but honestly, the average Ukrainian on the front lines, I like, unless like they're Azov or one of these other people who have done some sick shit, I have no ill will against them. I don't really think about them at all. I mean, just uh, they're just like the rest of us, really. That's all I'll say for that much.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it's not just like one ideological unit. I'm saying there's a kind of prevailing attitude that has been popularized ever since the success of the Maidan coup in 2014. And there's like, oh, I'm just saying, there's lots of individuals that are probably responsible for just like, they know that they're shelling just apartment buildings, right? They're not really um going for military targets. And I'm well aware that the Russians have killed hundreds and hundreds and
Oh
hundreds in
yes.
this war,
Um,
with some shelling in some towns, especially around Kiev. That I would say there was a probably a very small percentage of people that wanted to see Russia succeed in this invasion. So I understand that, but I'm talking about the longer war that has been going on in the East for the last eight
yeah,
years.
and I'm glad you brought that up
Um,
because I do
and
think
like I say, that said, yeah, that said, all I want to say is it's conflicting. You just watch these guys like ants, in one of these trenches, and it's just it's horrific. Huge munitions going off. They're struggling for their life. It's just unbelievable. It's
yes.
it's it's very sad. And I should say, there have been three officers, uh, one general on the Russian side. So this is the fourth general who's been killed. All of these deaths happened in the Donbass area, or let's say some were in that Kherson region. So the Ukrainians lost a right lieutenant and a left lieutenant, and the Russians lost a general who fought with their troops. This is the fourth one, and his name started with a K. Let me get his name.
But just to touch on what you were saying, just
Yeah,
about
go
that,
ahead.
and what you were saying about the Maidan creating this mentality was interesting. I do think that the Maidan has served as something of a mind virus to the Ukrainian general public, where, and I know a lot of you do
Hmm.
hate this term, and I kind of hate this term myself, but I can't really think of a better applicable term. It is this petty nationalism where it isn't only that we want to be a Ukrainian nation, but just the fact that any Russianness needs to be purged, and that we're just going to go through spiteful lengths in order to, again, just like whether it's shell an apartment building or just again, really, honestly, the word for it is petty acts like that. So I get
Yeah,
completely what you're getting at. And did you find the name yet?
I did. So this is General Kutuzov. Kutuzov fought in Syria along with his men, like on the ground. He was a hard ass guy. And that's still a tradition amongst the Russians for like generals to go on the ground and fight with the troops. It it sounds insane to most Western leaders now. But I think what you just said is actually a really interesting point. It's how you use a moral argument to distract people from other concerns. You see this even in America, right? So you had an article that came out and said, um, we have to make Americans care more about this war and less about gas prices, right? You had it, for instance, with COVID, right? You had it with the George Floyd protests, right? There's always a moral reason for you to ignore a failing economy, uh, a corrupt political system, and moralism is a way to avoid addressing firsthand problems. That is, even if you made Russia disappear off the face of the earth, Ukraine would be stuck with the same oligarchs. There would be the same amount of corruption. It is an incredible bait and switch that this propaganda has done. Um, if you follow the logic, what they're saying is, well, at least I'll be proud of being Ukrainian, and it would still be the most corrupt country in Europe, and with a shattered economy and so on and so on. But at least the Russians aren't involved. Now I know they blame Putin and the Russians for every ill, but the fact of the matter is, Russia does not really control Ukraine, and it did not have like this amazing control over Ukraine. In the same way that Russia exerts far more control over Belarus, let's say prior to 2020. That wasn't the case in Ukraine.
Yes,
But anyhow,
Ukraine since
so
post-Soviet
they
collapse
make it
was
a
always
moral
back and
issue.
forth, but
Yeah, instead of taking care of like first order issues that are directly affecting their lives.
yes, and you can see that time and time again. There's countless examples of that. And the one last thing I will say about Ukraine, I sent you these maps earlier in the week, but these are from I saw these a week ago. That just compares the square mileage of land captured by Russia and Ukraine superimposed over other countries. So, just to give an idea of how much land Russia has
Oh
taken.
yeah.
Now, keep in mind, excluding Russia, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. So, when you look at a map of what areas of Ukraine are under Russian control, it can be misleading. But just in terms of raw square mileage, here's just a few maps. That's the UK, so practically all of England and Wales. Um, Italy, practically, again, almost the entire peninsula is would be under the control hypothetically. You would have practically all of Austria and Switzerland, and almost all of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, just to give an idea of, in raw numbers, how much square mileage of Ukrainian land they control. And that's not even getting into what Ukrainian land they control. When it comes to the figures, there's an estimate of upwards of 90% of Ukraine's industry is under Russian control. Now, I know a lot of people have been skeptical and critical of the Russian war effort because it hadn't taken major cities like Kiev and that they actually pulled out from the, I guess you could say, siege they were allegedly laying on Kiev. But at the end of the day, this looks much more in line with what they're doing with this war. I don't know what their post-war plans are. I can't imagine this conflict lasting too much longer. I would say it's only a matter of. I would say within the next 3 months it would probably be over. Don't quote me on that, but just a rough saying. Especially when you have someone, as I touched on last week, like Kissinger, coming out and saying that the
Yeah.
West needs to press Ukraine to make a deal. There's a certain way the winds are blowing, and of course the lack of enthusiasm within the U.S. And also, the last thing I also saw is Bulgaria is done sending, let's just say, aid to Ukraine via munition shipments, which is interesting in particular because one of the artillery rounds. Bulgaria is one of the last places in the world that manufactures this artillery round for a certain Soviet piece. I can't remember the name of the exact piece, but it's not even cutting them off fully. Bulgaria is still willing to sell them to Ukraine, but they're just going to stop sending shipments as support. And of course, you look at the sentiments of Bulgarian populations, at least pre-war, of their attitude towards Russia. Upwards of 70% of them had a at least somewhat positive opinion towards the Russians. So you do have that, and Bulgaria is also particularly infamous so far as Europe and especially Eastern Europe are concerned of being a real just puppet of the U.S. State Department. They are falling in lockstep, which is why the sentiments of the population, the sentiments of the government, are almost always so different. For example, they'll go along with or at least try to go along with the energy embargoes, whereas you have in several major Bulgaria cities pro-Russia rallies upon the outbreak of the war. It was Serbia and Bulgaria were the only places in Europe you really saw anything like that happening. But that is all I had for on the ground in Ukraine right now. If we missed any last thing that you've thought of, I will hand it over to you. If not, we do have a few other stories for the night.
The only thing I would add is morale, even according to Western journalists, is very low right now. Um, they are running. I saw another video of Ukrainian troops refusing to fight because they're low on munitions. They don't. Frankly, they said it's like we're fighting tanks with our iPhones. There was a Reuters crew and I believe an RT crew, two different crews. Both of them contained Reuters reporters. The one originating going from east to west was shelled, and several Reuters journalists were injured, and their driver was killed. RT filmed this, or like RT had this video. Again, I don't know how RT got it. Was it present in one of the convoys of these journalistic convoys that were going there? I don't know. But there was another successful uh, um, reporters' arrival into the war zone that was made up of Reuters journalists, and that's what they're reporting. I would say in closing that it will probably take at least a few more weeks before Lysychansk is taken, because it is on a hill, and I think the Ukrainians are aware that even Zelensky said, if it collapses there, we don't know what awaits the rest of the country. So with that, you also have, as I said at the beginning of the show, a pincer movement towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. That if that happens, then that means that Lysychansk is completely cut off, and that is where the majority of the forces are. The road to resupply uh, Lysychansk and that bit of Severodonetsk that they control is under Russian artillery fire. So they might not control the roads per se, but they can pick off what is on the roads. And this makes resupplying the Ukrainians very difficult. So, you know, I would look for a breaking point at the end of June. And what happens after that, I don't know.
Yes, and I think that is the best summary we can give for the past week of events in Ukraine. And I will now get into some of the other stories we have right now. This next one is tangentially related to the Russia Ukraine issue, where Orban was successful in his dissent against the European Union sanctions and managed to get the aforementioned Patriarch Kirill of Moscow off of the sanctions list, because that was one of the ones that the EU was trying to list, which was
Yeah.
even controversial by EU standards, putting the leader of an entire church on there. So they managed to get that struck down, get that taken out of the sanctions package, and tie that up yet again. So Orban serving the role of Putin's puppet in Brussels once again, as they would have you. And then within the same week, that of course the U.S. sent another several $billions to Ukraine, and of course as there was outpour of both moral and material support for Ukraine over the past week, and again that's been happening for the past 3-4 months, so that's nothing new. But over the past week, Orban and Vucic had I believe it was a hog roast together, which that was an interesting ploy by them, which further continues the trend of the Serbo-Hungarian friendship, as we mentioned a couple episodes back.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it does look like slowly but surely, and as those surrounding, especially Balkan nations, do join in, and of course there's always the back and forth in countries like Austria, Germany, Italy, etc., on what they actually want to do with these energy sanctions. But it looks like once again the Europe that's never been more united is cracking more and more when it comes to this, and that the motivation, the lack of motivation, I should say, that you find in the U.S. Also comes over to Europe. That Europeans don't have the same grudge against Russia. A few exceptions aside, for example, say Poland and the Baltic states, probably the main two, along with a few other significant chunks of the population spread out Eastern European nations. But in terms of that animus against Russia that they've tried to build for the past 3 months, or past 3 months especially, but the past 8 years in general, it just is not sticking. And once again, touching on what we were talking about earlier, they want to make the moralistic arguments. Russia is an aggressive power. It annexed Crimea. It subverted the American election. It got Brexit done. They're throwing all of these at. I can't afford to heat my home this winter. I can't afford to fill up my car. I can hardly afford groceries. They're again answering these much more immediate concerns with how your suffering is actually sticking it to Putin, which clearly isn't panning out because Ukraine isn't holding out nearly as well as they would like us to believe. So it's this double whammy where even the propagandistic feel good reason they try to sell you is also blatantly false. Because at least sometimes when they do it, there's a kernel of truth, or they can manipulate to look like something is true. Like, for example, with the Biden administration, you can talk about all these things, but did you know that there's the first black woman in the treasury or whatever? Or again, just like these stupid things that will
Yeah.
appeal to a certain cross section of the population to keep them just happy enough to maintain a support base. But again, even that's not panning out at this rate. So the European Union, once again, going back to the question I've been asking for the past 3.5 months, how much pain will they tolerate for the American empire? And it's really starting to be questionable because when the war first started, it looked like they were going to fall right in line, that they were going to do everything that Washington and Brussels, which, by Washington by proxy, Brussels told them to do. But it looks like even the strong players in the European Union, for example, I think Germany, with its waffling back and forth, shows that the vaunted European unity they've been trying to build for the past 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union is just that superficial. And I mean, we saw this with Brexit. It made people question it. 2018, 2019 were really bad years for the European Union between the yellow shirt protests and even some of the threats of migratory flows out of Turkey. And then you had Macron walking that tightrope, for example, when he blocked EU expansion of several states, such as, I believe it was Albania and Serbia, he delayed
North
for. Yeah,
Macedonia.
Albania and North Macedonia. Um, he still, again, Serbia is always, and now as time goes on, they're getting less and less away from that. But they've always walked that edge with join the European Union, don't join the European Union, whatever. But particularly, I think it was Albania, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. But I know it was Albania and North Macedonia, and then there was a third country in there in particular that they blocked membership to. Uh, and again, so the European Union, after Brexit and even arguably after Trump, has not been the strongest position. I think a lot of the Eurocrats, as I suppose you could call them, thought this war was going to create a sense of unity around the idea of a common threat, but of course that didn't pan out when the economic realities actually did hit, and they're back to where they were in probably 2017, where they're not the strongest they've ever been, but they're not the weakest they've ever been. Except, I would say the major difference with that is they have to apply immense amount of pressure to keep that status quo, I suppose you could call it.
Yeah, I mean, they've even they've now figured out ways, and this is their rationale, to buy oil, which is ostensibly Russian oil, but which has been bought by another country. In this case, it's most likely India. India denies it, but it's most likely happening nonetheless. There are probably other countries involved as well. So the rationale is, well, Russia is going to sell their oil to them for far less. So at least we'll buy the oil that we need. However, we won't. Russia will get a smaller cut. Well, I mean, that depends on volume. Now, way back in 2018 and 2019, I think on one of the shows we discussed how Russia needs gas. It might have been actually during the start of COVID, because gas prices were plummeting, and we were talking about how Russia published like what it needed oil to be sold at in order that the Russian state can keep cruising along. And that was at $45 a barrel. Well, Russia is selling oil to India, I think for about 87 to 90, $95 a barrel. So it's making twice what it needs. And according to Reuters, it's done double the amount of business compared to last year. Um, Shipping container boats from Malta, Cyprus, and Greece are also twice as active at this point. And what they're doing is the oil will be bought in a country, the flags will be changed. Nobody quite knows where these boats are coming and going. And they will go to a port, and the company there that is in charge of the energy needs of the country will buy it, and that'll be that. So everyone will pretend that for good optics, that they have an oil embargo against Russia. But the truth of the matter is, as we pull back, We understand that Europe does not have enough arable land to feed itself. It does not even have enough fertilizer. It certainly does not have energy for the kind of sophisticated, technologically advanced civilization that it is. The only way it can do that is with Russia. And that is what they are denying. If Russia was such an evil meanie with all these levers of power, it would have, I mean, it would have done far worse things. What you see, in my opinion, is a country just pushed and pushed and pushed to the hilt. The other kind of development between Russia and Europe is in there's an educational system established in Europe called the uh, Bologna Congress or something. Anyhow, it basically develops the general curriculum for all European nations. It's a standard, right? So before Maidan, right? If you were a Russian doctor or teacher or maybe even scientist, and you wanted to earn more money, you went to Europe, I mean, your degree would not be recognized, right? Now, Russia went along with the Bologna, and it still never got recognized. So this effort by Europe and the US to treat Russia like some colonial backward country at all costs has been in there. Well, I mean, realistically, it's been in there for 2 centuries,
Yes, and I think you
or
can
nearly two
even
centuries.
you or the audience can correct me if I'm wrong, but particularly when it comes to the energy trade, even when the Soviet Union was still standing, there was that not that much harsh of an effort to keep that embargo on there because they still understood that well, it's a behemoth of energy and that we need. I mean, you had Nord Stream 1 built between Germany and the Soviet Union, I believe it was, and I think that was even
No, that came right after in the 2000s. But the
oh, okay.
Yamal pipeline,
Yes, yes, that's what I was
yeah,
thinking
the
of.
Yamal pipe, those pipelines, the Druzhba pipeline, the land-based pipelines, they were built, I believe, in the 70s. Um, and America contested those as well.
Yes, and
But again, Europe, it's the reality of the situation. Like,
And I mean, if you look at the situation before then, in the early 20th century, the major Western European nations, France, UK, etc., even Germany for the very early part of the 20th centuries, did have colonies in which they could directly extract the resources from. Now, that we're talking a early 20th century industrialized economy versus with the colonies versus a 21st century industrialized economy without the colonies. So even if you were to think that France is going to go on this neo-colonial blitz and and find some way, whether by soft or hard conquest, to reclaim all of its former colonies, which France has done a pretty good job in keeping economic ties with their former colonial possessions. That's been one of the more interesting things they've done with their foreign policy in recent years. But I mean, even then, I know you always hear about how resource rich Africa is, blah blah blah. But I mean, only that's going to go so far. And then you have the irony that uh, Libya, a pretty big energy producer, has been destroyed for the past 11 years there. And it also comes the migratory flows in Europe. Then you have, under Trump, of course, 2018, 2019, the Europeans bending to the scrapping of the JCPOA and putting sanctions on Iran and not importing Iranian oil, which that Iranian oil, like the Russian oil and gas, is going to China. Saudi Arabia is working with China and Russia at this point. And on that note, Saudi
yeah.
Arabia has moved to raise gas prices, which was predicted when the U.S. at least announced that they were going to look into, Biden, learning from Trump, I know I made this joke last episode, is monitoring the situation. Don't worry, Biden is monitoring the situation. Thought about renewing and reactivating these idle oil wells. But in response to that, of course, Saudi Arabia jacked up the prices. And you also have news regarding Venezuela, which, of course, we tried to uproot for the past 3 years now. You had the attempts in
Hmm.
2018, 2019, that the U.S. State Department has allowed the Italian energy company Eni, that's ENI, and the Spanish oil company Repsol to to carry out deliveries of amounts of oil from Venezuela to Europe. So they're circumventing now, with the blessing of the U.S. State Department, their own sanctions on Venezuela because it got desperate. That was one of the things that was floated, that Biden might try some sort of reconciliation with Venezuela in order to open up the oil from there. But it looks like, at least for the Europeans, he has approved it. Now, Venezuela is not going to produce enough oil, and I don't even think they have a natural gas
Yeah.
industry, in order to support European industrial civilization. I'm sorry. At that point, and even if you were to go back to colonialism, I think still at that point, look at it, you would still depend to some degree on Russia. Whether you were to get that from Africa, whether you get that from the Middle East, even from, I think the United States is probably the only power that could contend. Which, for all its faults, at least Trump gave them the alternative that, look, you'll have to pay more for American energy, but at least we'll have energy to send to you. And I mean,
Hmm.
it's just the unfortunate reality of Europe that most European countries are not energy independent. I mean, you have France's nuclear power, but once again, I will bring up, France still imports a ton of oil, and you look, sure, you can use nuclear to power your power grid, but when you're talking about both heavy and light industry, you need the oil, you need that natural gas to run those things.
Right, and especially the heavy oil for some of the machinery there. They're not going to have batteries retrofitted to them, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
as far as I
Sorry, Elon
understand,
Musk
it's a
is
good
not
thing.
making is not making heavy machinery. There's not going to be any Tesla heavy machinery anytime soon. Now he's welcome to prove me wrong. I'm kind of on the fence about the guy, but again, I
Yeah,
wouldn't want to trust my industrial economy to uh, what are ostensibly battery powered toys.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, as far as I know, with Venezuela, and it's good you brought it up. Apparently, they're not going to, and you're right, a very small amount is going to go to Europe, but the profits from that will go against its debt. They will not go to, I guess, any other coffers, but at least it's paying off some of the debt. And there was a video, that surfaced a few days ago with Guaido. I don't know what's going on, but there's like a crowd in an outdoor dining area, and people are throwing chairs at each other. It looked like a U.S. Uh, fight in a school cafeteria, frankly, where everybody's got a
Oh,
one of
one
those
of
plastic
those
chairs, and they put.
vibrant inner city schools with all the diversity.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yes, a diversity high school. So yeah, that's what you saw. So I mean, you know, Venezuela knows America's in a tough spot, and if it pays off some of their debt, that's fine. Uh, but the thing that strikes me the most is, right, like if I were a strategist and I was in the Biden administration, I would think that maybe starting the Keystone, maybe like not, maybe opening up some kind of properties for energy development. I would open some of those up, right? Like even in a limited way, considering the war. He's not going to be morally reprimanded from his supporters on Twitter. They won't be in huge droves. I don't think. And so this is why I think it's people wonder, like, is the American government, because it's so stupid, is it working in collusion with another government, or with a kind of cabal? Like, why is this happening? But I tend to think now, I mean, all those things are sort of partially true. They were more true a few years ago, but now we're at a breaking point. We really are entering a multipolar world. But I think the reason why this is happening is, I think the first giveaway was COVID. They knew that this would consolidate wealth into a smaller number of hands, and that they would impoverish the population. so the population would have fewer avenues of successfully revolting or organizing resistance to the government.
Yes,
And for
I would agree
them,
with that.
I think they want the higher gas prices. And as long as it makes the populace weaker and it eats at and erodes the middle class, they are fine with that.
Yes, and I think
I think that's the best explanation for it.
yes, and I think one of the things people overlook when they try to find an explanation for the current crisis in leadership, I suppose you'd call it, is that they attribute the problem starting in 2020 with the outbreak of COVID, when realistically you can go back several years prior. And I would put that to about 2014, late term Obama. Now, of course, the roots of that we can go back even further and further. But just in terms of the recent epoch, I would say we're in, you could go back to late term Obama. You know, Crimea had fallen to Russia. Syria had been a flop. Libya, while technically successful, was a Pyrrhic victory if there ever was one. Realizing that the American empire is not what it once was. The American empire was not what it was a decade ago, not what it was in the 1990s. And they pursued a new strategy, and a lot of that was, of course, the banditry that you said. Of course, Convid gave them a perfect opportunity for that, and they could only increase that sense. But I think where a lot of people analysis fails, as good as it may be, is that they don't look before 2020 when they look at these sort of things. And I would say what you have laid out is probably the best explanation I've heard of it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you have to. You can look at Europe as another example. Like America's okay if Europe becomes less wealthy because ultimately it's less likely to break away from its power. You also have to look at like they hate you. You have to accept that they hate you more readily and that there's less room for negotiation. I know it's very blackpilling, but I think they look at poverty really as a way of them maintaining their power. We theorize that, there's a, and I mean, we, the collective dissident, right? There's lots of us who theorize, for instance, that, well, if they keep going this way, they're going to lose it all. And that might happen. It might be the case that they are not going to be able to do this forever. But I think if anything is a hallmark of this global homo regime, it is that they do not have long range plans, or they have hubris in the plans that they have committed that will see them through. Um, Keith Woods did a video today touching on this issue and talked about how China has nationalized their economy. Russia is definitely working towards that, but we are going into a kind of a feudal state, and the reason is, um, the gay GAE um, does not believe in nationalism unless it's of a country that it's at war with one of its adversaries. So I think that is what that's another way of looking at it. Because there's no nationalization process, there is a kind of vulture economy that is taking place. And they see making the population weaker, kind of like a Central American or South American model, making it so weak that it can never hope to um, change things in, let's say, America and Canada, but particularly in America. And that's what I see developing. The
Yes, and
only thing that can change that, the only thing that can snap them out of it, is if there's enough international pressure that will force them to change course, or they will lose everything. And in another stream with Borzoi and Joel Davies, Borzoi said, he goes, the moment that they sense that this empire is really weak, and I think before the end of 2022, we are going to see that. The knives and forks from around the world will appear out of thin air, and people will be interested in carving up America. That's a possibility. I don't know exactly, of course, what will happen. All I can say is the if this was a more unified country, just on the economic level, I'm not talking about the ethnic and racial level. but just on the political and economic level, where American elites understand that they're in a titanic struggle for their civilization, it would make sense for them to be more energy independent in order that um, let's say that they're able to fight well against China and Russia. But instead, what they're doing is they're sabotaging themselves. And the only thing that can come out of that is, well, more poverty within the country. But that makes them weaker on the global stage. But it temporarily consolidates their power vis-a-vis the, as you say, the confid model of devastating small businesses and consolidating economic and financial power. So I look at this as simply as like the South American model or the Central American model
Yeah, the Banana
of
Republic
containing
approach.
populist power. Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, I would certainly agree with that, and of course that is only a very short thing. You can look at the longevity of those governments in Latin America, and experience will tell you it's never very long. Now, of course, they have a bit more of a solid grasp, but point being is they can afford this style of governance while they are still relatively uncontested, and that is slipping away. And especially if this war in Ukraine, if by the time it's said and done, taking a look at the end of this year, if it turned out remarkably well for Russia, or even reasonably well for Russia, then, and that's not even to mention what China might do in the rest of the year, whether that be something involving Taiwan, which I doubt, or just continuing its economic expansion, such as this deal they made with, I believe it was 10 other Pacific nations, including Australia and New Zealand, this massive economic deal, trying more or less creating a parallel replacement for the Trans Pacific Partnership, trying to rebuild something like that that focuses more on the economic model in China. But if we see something, a move like that from China, or some other great big economic breakthrough, or some other great political breakthrough from one of these countries, or if I've mentioned before, if anything goes down in the Middle East, if Iran and Israel, via their proxies or even directly, finally trade blows for a sustained amount of time, and especially if you get all three of those happening simultaneously, then I think that would trigger that change. But speaking of the Middle East, we do have a bit of news about Syria. So we did talk about last week how Turkey was launching the military operation to link up to SDF controlled zones, to Turkish controlled zones from the SDF, and break SDF control from that in order to solidify their foothold into Syria. There were reports of Russian presence moving back to Syria that was previously withdrawn, and there are reports that military police units that were previously deployed to Ukraine are now being redeployed to Syria in order to deal with this recent Turkish action. So, if that is true, it's still unconfirmed thus far, but if it's true that Russia is diverting forces from Ukraine to Syria, I think that's very telling about the Russian war effort in Ukraine, that either, which is, we'll start with the far more unlikely one. Either it's a lost cause and Russia's hanging up the white flag and withdrawing from Ukraine, which I don't believe for a second, or things are going remarkably well for Russia and Ukraine, where they can afford to divert even just a slightest
Mm-hmm,
amount
mm-hmm.
to Syria. And I believe it's probably the second there, and that they can focus on shoring up Syria. And like I said, if my pie in the sky prediction that was much more reasonable, I made it, about Idlib falling, if that comes to fruition on top of Ukraine, like, when it comes to Russia's standing geopolitically, it is going to be a year of unmitigated victory for them, despite whatever poor performance they had in Ukraine. If they pull off Ukraine, which, again, all likelihood says they will, barring World War III, and if they drive the last pocket of resistance out of Idlib, and maybe even going too far, and this might be getting a bit too far out of the realm of reality, and broker some sort of deal with Turkey vis-a-vis Syria. I mean, even if they don't come to some sort of agreement with Turkey, but if they maintain the current stability, and dare I even say expand the current stability, in relative stability in Syria, I should say, then it is an uncontested year of victories for Russia on the world stage, and there's really no other way to put that.
Yeah, I mean, there is. I mean, there's a lot of problems in Syria that are not solved. Yes, you have that axis between Damascus and Aleppo, where most of the business and most of the population lives. That's fine and working, but there are always insurgents from Idlib disturbing things. Uh, Basically, in the northern and western part of the Aleppo Oblast, sometimes coming into areas that are they're farming villages that are kind of like suburbs of Aleppo proper. And there are a lot of um, Arab accounts on Twitter that are seeing signs in this region that belong to IS or Harat al-Sham and other al-Qaeda affiliated groups, and they're saying like where is this progress? And I would say that I've said it before. Russia really has no allies. Like anything that Russia does, the reason Russia is doing it is because it's the only country that can do it. No other country, like within that Middle Eastern and East European complex of nations, has sovereignty. They don't have sovereignty. It's that simple. It has no allies. The Chinese are not going to come to the rescue. Um, it just doesn't exist. It has to do this completely on its own. Its population, it's a big country, but it's not like super big. I mean, America has a population that's almost twice Russia's. It's actually a little more than twice Russia's. And so it's such a precarious situation for other reasons as well. For one, Turkey tried to bait Russia at the beginning in 2016 into a war that would involve NATO, and Russia avoided that bait. Russia had to really skillfully manage that situation. And I don't think people appreciate that. And as far as Israel goes, that is America's red line. What Ukraine is to Russia, that's what Israel is for the US. And so Russia has had to play things there very, very, very carefully. Um, it does not have a reliable partner in any meaningful way with Turkey. And you know what Turkey is trying to do is trying to resettle Arabs that it took from Syria. Some of them are just fleeing. Some of them were enemies of Assad, and is trying to like relocate them into these zones of influence that it's taken over on the northern border of Syria that runs along the Turkish border, which will infringe on lands that were normally held by the Kurds. But then the Kurds took over Arab lands just due east of there. So uh, there's no. I mean, I've if this was the 60s or 70s, Russia would have had far more leverage, and that's one of the reasons why Middle Eastern countries were targeted very quickly after the Soviet Union fell. The two big theaters of war that happened were Iraq and Yugoslavia, because that's where, during the times of the Soviet Union, you could not make those kinds of incursions. And this is the world that we have now, post-Soviet collapse.
Yeah, and also an
So
interesting
Russia.
point since
So I mean, I. What's that?
you had also brought up Iraq, and I think there's an interesting point to be made here about nations outliving their usefulness. Also, you have to keep in mind that the Gulf War was 2 years after Iraq's war with Iran ended.
Yes, yes, but it also overlaps with the war that broke out in Yugoslavia.
Yes, yes.
They know Russia is like in on a kind of terminal decline. It can't support any of these regions, and then that's when they go in. As soon as that happens, they're going in within like literally 6, 7 months, uh, roughly speaking. Let's say within a year, and it's a moment that they've been waiting for decades. And what Russia is doing is moving into this area that has been destroyed, and it's had to create all kinds of agreements with the Israelis, with the Turks, even with the Americans, as to how to keep things functional in Syria. While America continues to steal oil and wheat from Syria, that will not remain in Syria, and it's completely illegal what they're doing. Um, Turkey will continue to support that little um, province of Idlib, where so many of these jihadis find their safety, and Israel will, continue to bomb Damascus and the environs with whatever missiles that are not intercepted by the Syrians. And there's threat even more now. Like, I mean, Russia only last year took care of a resurgence on the border with Israel, north of the Golan Heights, where it was one of those regions south of Damascus where the uprising against Assad began, right? That was the corridor, because it's kind of hilly there. That was the corridor that ISIS fighters and others, including the guys who fought, including the guys who um, just before the Bataclan, the three jihadists who shot up the Jewish supermarket in Paris, and amongst other things, and Charlie Hebdo. Uh, two of those two fighters fought in Syria, and they were treated by Israelis. It's ironic that then they come back and then they did what they did in Paris. So that region was only quelled. Remember, like last year, that was another potential hotspot that could have erupted. So America is basically trying to keep Syria poor through sanctions, stealing their oil, stealing their wheat, in order to uh, bring to boil as much civilian discontent as possible. And Israel demoralizes them, and Turkey demoralizes the population with strikes and ongoing, never-ending war.
Yeah,
And
so
then
Syria has
Syria,
become a series of just stamping out fires that break out through all parts of the country, particularly in the east, because as you were saying, that Damascus to Aleppo corridor, that western coastline is more or less a secure country. Now, they are still feeling the strain of having their resources robbed from them, of course. But throughout eastern Syria, you always hear about it's so and so ice tech. And then there was that couple stretch of months in 2020 when it was just a weekly assassination of Syrian intelligence officers, Syrian ground officers,
yeah,
or just Syrian
yeah,
officials in general. And again,
yeah, and Iranians as well.
yes, not to forget the Iranian presence in the country as well. And, you know, that's why I said relatively stable Syria, because it's better than it was, say, in
Hmm.
2015, 2016. But at this point, it is a floodgate, and they are holding it back, and they do need to do something to prevent that from breaking. And that's why Russia still has to and Russia and Iran, for that matter, still have to dedicate so much to Syria in order to keep it stable. It's stable because of what is ostensibly outside intervention, not because the all the threats in the country have been dealt with.
Right. And you have like accounts basically saying like, why isn't Russia doing more? Like, they're not, honestly, they're not looking at this realistically. Like, remember when Israel flew behind a passenger plane to um I mean, it normally does that anyways. It fires from Lebanon into Syria, but they were ghosting a Russian plane with like 8 Russian officers, like high up officers, and the Syrians shot missiles to intercept the jet, which is an ongoing thing. Um, and the Israelis moved out of the way, and it essentially killed the Russians by blowing up the Russian plane. Like, Russia has lost blood and treasure in this, right? And as I said, if it was the Arab world before the Soviet Union fell, this wouldn't be happening. No way. And if it had happened, um, then this Russian intervention would have would have ended things there much sooner. But there's also another thing. Our friend Mario, him and I were talking, and I said, in the same way that the right in the West, like you can see that the right is gaining some kind of popularity within European and European derived countries over the last 10 years. Part of it, of course, we know is um, the, the complete insanity of neoliberalism, but part of it is from a feeling of total instability and uncertainty. And I would say that in a sense that is what has happened in the Middle East, right? These fractile wars, very ideologically based, um, which began, I would say Afghanistan, ironically, was the beginning of this in '79, in so much as that um, the U.S. strategy was to make uh, religion dominate ideology, and that too is part of what I'm talking about when I say if it was the Arab world of the 60s and 70s, this wouldn't have happened. Now you have so much religious fanaticism in these areas because of, let's say, what are perceived are failures of either an American regime, a secular regime beating one of their own secular regimes, or just secularism itself. And so Syria is looked at as a secular regime, hostile to America, and America hostile to it. But there is a feeling that it too should not be secular. That secularism itself is like, one of the evils of communism, or is like the evil of communism in the late 70s, and that transition that took place in the 80s, and then finally, the new world after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think that is another element that people should look at when they're looking at Syria.
Yes, and
So there is
I mean,
the yeah,
because Assad and Syria in general are the last standing Arab nationalist or Ba'athist state because after
yeah,
Nasser fell in Egypt, that was out of the question. Saddam Hussein has been out of Iraq for 20 years now, almost 20 years now, and not to mention, it's not like Iraq and Syria were ever on friendly terms between Hafez al Assad and Saddam Hussein. So there's that. But the idea of the um, I suppose, yeah, secular is the best word for it. Secular Arab nationalism has been dead in the water since the 1980s, and I'm really glad you brought up the Soviet-Afghan War because need we all be reminded that the birth of this modern wave of jihadism from the 90s onward was a direct result of the American organized resistance groups against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I think that
yeah,
bears repeating time and time again.
yeah. This
But
is yes. This is a 40, 42, 43-year old development that we're looking at. That's what we're looking at. And I think the only way that Syria can be saved, of course, America has to be diminished in power, but there has to be more cooperation with Turkey, because a lot of the Gulf states right now are behind Russia. They want to make amends for Syria. Only America stands in the way of that from fully happening. Only America, probably with proxies within Qatar and other Arab Gulf states, is helping some individuals who are helping ISIS fighters from fighting there. Those guys, they're not going to, like, I don't want to diminish how fanatical and how true believing they are in their cause, but the fact of the matter is somebody has to pay for them, and that money has to come from somewhere. And my guess is it's not necessarily people at the highest levels in Saudi Arabia, but people just underneath them, people who are working closely with the U.S. State Department, and probably even Turkey, definitely Israel. Jordan is another kind of a sleeper that you don't hear about. Remember, they were going to raise a huge army in Jordan, and they were going to invade Syria. That was back in 2015, very shortly before Russia got involved in the war. Um, the only thing that can happen is like Erdogan is looking for, I think, a deal, but can he be really trusted? Will he want more influence in the Balkans? Um, he talked about that recently, that he was mocking one of the European the Greeks. Yes, and so it's a very complicated affair. I suppose the one white pill about Syria is it. This is the second time that we've heard that Erdogan is going to invade Syria, this time for sure, and it's really going to happen. And he's backed off the second time in 10 days. And I'm not saying it's never going to happen, but it is a bit of a white pill. He could be playing games to get something. And by him doing that, he doesn't make the Russians or the Americans happy. That gives them much less ability to wield power. So I'm assuming he's doing this basically for domestic power, to get a consensus amongst his constituents who support him. The economy is not doing well in Turkey, so he might be doing the saber rattling for that purpose, uh, going for an optics victory, if you will. But he is still going to be a key in finding a way to settle the situation in Syria. He's one of the keys. The other keys are America and Israel, but particularly America.
Yes, and I suppose that's all we had for the show today. And if you have any last minute stories that you think we forgot, I suppose we can cover those now. But if not, I can go ahead and bring it to a close.
No, I don't. I don't have anything. The only thing I forgot to mention in more of the Ukraine minutia is so four foreign mercenaries were killed the last few days in the Donbass. I believe an Aussie, a Dutchman, a Frenchman, and another guy. He might have been from the UK. Um, yeah, I mean um, they're slowly being ground down in that region, and as you said, Russia is sending forces back to Syria, and that can only mean that things in Ukraine are going their way. And there's a lot of headlines, frankly, that are saying that. The Guardian had a headline that basically said Russia's winning the economic war, which is what we've been saying for like 6 weeks, and that Putin is not interested in negotiations. He's not going to leave Ukraine. And in fact, one of the ministers in his cabinet has just stated that Kherson and Zaporozhye are off are off the books. They are not going to be negotiated with. The Ukrainians, I think, have realized this, and now some of their troops are leaving the Donbass oblast and are moving down towards southwest to Zaporozhye and setting up fortifications for that city where the Morosich plant is, which the Russians have already bombed. So anyhow, that's all I have.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning to this episode of the War Report. Once again, I said it was going to be a short show. Here we are in an hour and 34 minutes. That tends to happen a lot, even though I suppose an hour 34 is short nowadays. But uh, I hope to see you all next time, and of course, we'll have plenty of news. And just depending on how fast or slow the news cycle goes, we could be back at the end of the week, maybe not till next week, but we'll certainly be around. And we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care, guys.